The rancher thought it was just an injured Mustang until he saw what was hidden underneath. Out on the edge of the canyon, in the biting wind, he ropes a broken horse. But when the dust settles, it's not just a horse lying in the dirt. It's a secret no man on the frontier was meant to find. Under the tangle of rawhide is a wounded woman cast out, hunted, carrying papers that could change the fate of the land itself. A quiet act of mercy draws him into a storm of railroad men, corrupt agents, and neighbors divided by fear and greed. Every hoofbeat, every whisper in town tightens the noose. The rancher must choose between safety and silence or risking everything. To stand beside her. What will he do when compassion collides with danger? And when the truth comes to light, will it save them both or destroy everything they love? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The winter wind howled across the high desert, whipping Donald Hart's coat as he guided his horse along the fence line. His eyes squinted against the bitter cold, scanning for any cattle that might have strayed during the recent storm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cottonwoods, their bare branches creaking like old bones in the wind. Donald pulled his collar higher, his weathered face etched with familiar lines of solitude. Since losing Martha to fever, and James in the war, these lonely rides had become his daily comfort. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the vast openness of the range helped quiet his grief. Flash of movement near the canyon rim caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another tumbleweed rolling in the wind, but then he saw it clearly, a Mustang, moving with an unnatural gait. The horse stumbled, its hide dark with sweat despite the cold. "Oh there, girl," Donald murmured, reaching for his lariat. Years of experience guided his hands as he formed the loop. The Mara's condition worried him. Her coat was torn in places, and burrs had twisted her mane into painful knots. Something about her movement seemed wrong. Beyond just injury, he spurred his horse forward, keeping his movements smooth and steady so as not to spook the injured animal. The Mari tried to bolt, but stumbled again, her strength clearly failing. Donald's loop sailed true, settling gently around her neck. "Easy now," he called softly, his voice carrying on the wind. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The Mustang fought weakly against the rope for a moment, then collapsed with a strange heavy sound, not like any horse fall Donald had ever heard. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he approached the fallen animal. That's when he saw it. Unusual bulges beneath the horse's belly, hidden by the long winter coat. The rawhide thongs had been cleverly concealed, wrapped around the animal's girth. Donald's heart quickened as he drew his knife. "Lord above," he whispered, carefully cutting through the bindings. As the thongs fell away, he discovered what the horse had been carrying. A young woman, unconscious and burning with fever. Her traditional Apache dress was torn and dirty, her black hair matted with the same burrs that tangled the horses. "Mane." The Mari gave a final shudder and went still. Donald caught the woman as she slipped from beneath the dead horse, cradling her slight form in his arms. Her skin felt hot against his cold hands, and dark bruises marked her face and arms. Someone had gone to desperate lengths to hide her this way. Strapped beneath a horse like contraband, Donald's mind raced with questions. But the bitter wind reminded him that answers would have to wait. The woman needed shelter, and fast. He lifted her as gently as he could onto his own horse, arranging her carefully across the saddle. Her head lolled against the horse's neck, and Donald tucked his spare blanket around her before leading them back toward his ranch. The sun was setting. By the time they reached his barn, painting the sky in fierce oranges and purples, Donald had spent the ride watching for pursuit. But the winter landscape remained empty, save for wheeling hawks and the occasional jackrabbit. Inside the barn, he lit the old lantern that hung from a beam, its warm light spreading across the hay-strewn floor. The woman hadn't stirred during their journey, but her breathing remained steady. Donald had prepared a makeshift bed in the cleanest corner. Using fresh hay and blankets from his house as he settled her onto the bed, her eyes flickered open for just a moment. They were dark and frightened, searching his face before closing. Again, Donald sat back on his heels, conflict churning at his gut. Harboring an Apache woman, especially one who'd clearly been running from something, could bring all manner of trouble to his door. Yet, as he studied her fever-flushed face, in the lantern light, Donald knew he couldn't turn her away. Whatever circumstances had led to her desperate flight, she was first and foremost a child of God in need of help. Martha would have said the same. He thought with a sad smile. He checked her temperature with the back of his hand, still dangerously high. The evening ahead would be long, but Donald's heart settled in to do what needed doing. He'd never been one to choose the easy path over the right one. The barn creaked in the wind as Donald gathered water, cloth, and what medicines he had. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Out to the rising moon? Another lonely night on the high desert, but this time with an unexpected guest who might bring changes Donald couldn't yet imagine. Piece by piece, he began cleaning the cuts and scrapes on her arms and face. His rough hands moved with surprising gentleness, the same care he'd once used when James was sick as a boy. The woman remained unconscious, but occasionally her brow would furrow as if troubled by dreams. "Rest easy now," Donald murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear. "You're safe here." He wasn't sure if that was true, not yet, but he meant to make it so. Whatever storm this young woman was running from, it would have to go through Donald's heart to reach her. That much, at least, he knew for certain. The lantern flickered as a stronger gust rattled the barn doors. Donald rose to check the latch, then returned to his vigil. Outside, the winter night deepened, stars emerging one by one in the vast desert sky. Inside, an unlikely guardian watched over his mysterious charge, warming water for willowbark tea and wondering what tomorrow might bring. The pale winter sunrise crept through Donald's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. He moved quietly, stoking the cook stove's embers and adding fresh wood. The coffee pot bubbled softly as he prepared a simple breakfast, his movements careful not to startle his unexpected guest. The young Apache woman lay on a makeshift bed, near the warmth of the stove, wrapped in clean blankets. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, and Donald had moved her from the barn to the relative comfort of his kitchen. The morning light revealed her features more clearly. High cheekbones, proud bearing even in sleep, and hands that occasionally tightened on the blankets as if ready to flee. Donald poured steaming water into a basin, gathering fresh cloths, and what healing supplies he had. The creak of a floorboard made him turn. The woman's eyes were open, dark and alert despite her weakness. She pushed herself up against the wall, watching his every move with wary intensity. "Name's Donald Hart," he said softly, keeping his distance. "Found you yesterday, out by the canyon. You're safe here." She didn't respond, her gaze darting between him and the door. Donald recognized the look of someone expecting betrayal. He'd seen it often enough in wounded animals. "Reckon those cuts need tending," he continued, gesturing to the basin. "If you'll allow it?" "No." Her voice was hoarse but firm. "I know agent's tricks." Donald set the basin down slowly. "Ma'am, I ain't no agent. Just a rancher who couldn't leave someone in need out in that cold." A shadow of uncertainty crossed her face. Donald remembered something and added, "Got your satchel from the canyon. Figured you'd want it." He retrieved the worn leather bag from where he'd stored it, laying it carefully on the kitchen table. The woman's eyes fixed on it immediately, relief visible in her posture, though she remained guarded. "My name is Nolan," she said, finally, watching as he stepped back from the table. Nodded, turning to the stove. "Coffee's ready, if you'd like some. Got cornbread, too." He busied himself with the cooking, giving her space to make her own choice. After several long moments, he heard her move, the rustle of blankets, followed by careful footsteps. When he glanced back, she had settled at the table, one hand resting protectively on her satchel. Donald set a cup of coffee and a plate of warm cornbread before her, then took a seat at the far end of the table. They ate in silence for a while, steam rising from their cups into the cool morning air. Why did you help me? Nalin asked suddenly, her voice stronger now. Donald considered his answer carefully. Seemed the only right thing to do. Found you half dead, strapped under that poor horse. Figured anyone in that situation needed help. Not questions. Something in his honest response seemed to reach her. Nalin's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her hand never left the satchel. The agent, Hensley, she began, her words measured. He came to our lands with papers, claiming my father's death meant our grazing rights were void. Her fingers tightened on the cup. When I proved him wrong, he tried to take me instead. Donald's weathered face darkened. He'd heard whispers of such corruption, government men using their power to steal from the tribes they were meant to protect. But hearing it firsthand, seeing the evidence of such cruelty in his own kitchen, stirred a deep anger in him. Got many of my people's children in his school, Nalin continued. Uses them to control their parents, but I teach there too. I saw his true nature. She paused, watching Donald's reaction. When he couldn't force me to sign away our land, he decided to sell me to men who don't ask questions. Donald's coffee cup hit the table harder than he intended. Ain't right, he said. Quietly, his voice rough with controlled fury. Ain't Christian nor lawful. The morning light strengthened, warming the kitchen's simple furnishings. Outside, snow clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising more winter weather. Donald rose, needing to tend to his ranch duties and check on the injured Mustang. Rest. Here, he told Nalin. You're welcome to anything you need. I'll be in the barn if you want air. The afternoon found Donald in the barn, carefully cleaning the Mustang's wounded leg. The horse had survived the night, though its condition remained delicate. He worked methodically, speaking soft words of encouragement as he applied healing. Salve dot movement in the doorway caught his attention. Nalin stood there, wrapped in one of his spare coats, watching his work with interest. His name is Ashki, she said softly, taking a careful step closer. He was my father's horse. Donald nodded, continuing his gentle ministrations. He's got spirit, carrying you like that. Good chance he'll heal, with time and care. Nalin moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch Ashki's neck. The horse nickered softly, recognizing her. Donald noticed her other hand still clutched the satchel, fingers occasionally brushing over what he guessed were papers inside. Perhaps proof of her claims about the grazing rights, the short winter. Day was already fading when they returned to the house. Snow had begun falling, thick flakes drifting past the windows. Donald built up the fire in the main room, laying out blankets nearby for warmth. From a wooden chest, he withdrew a carefully folded quilt, its pattern still bright despite its age. Was my Martha's, he explained, holding it out to Nalin. Reckon she'd want it used for comfort, not stored away gathering dust. Nalin hesitated before accepting the quilt, her fingers tracing the careful stitching. Your wife? Fever took her. 5 years passed, Donald said simply. Lost our boy James to the war too. Understanding passed between them, two people who knew the weight of loss. Nalin settled near the fire, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. Its colors glowed in the firelight, rich reds and blues against the white of the falling snow. Outside, Donald sat in his old chair, watching the flames dance. The woman's presence had already begun shifting something in his carefully ordered world. Her story of injustice and survival stirred memories of Martha's fierce sense of right and wrong, of James's idealistic belief in standing up for truth. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, Nalin finally allowed herself to truly rest, her breathing growing deep and even. Donald remained in his chair, a silent guardian as the winter night deepened around them. Morning arrived with a crystalline beauty, frost patterns delicately traced across the window panes like nature's own lacework. Donald woke to unexpected sounds from his kitchen, the gentle clinking of pots and the warm scent of cooking. He pulled on his boots and coat, moving quietly down the hallway. Nalin stood at his cook stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush with practiced motions. She had already stoked the fire and set the coffee to boil. The sight stopped Donald in his tracks. It had been years since anyone but himself had worked in this kitchen. "Good morning," she said without turning, her voice steady and clear. "I hope you don't mind. Seemed right to repay your kindness." Donald cleared his throat. "Much obliged. Been a while since breakfast wasn't my own doing." She ladled the steaming mush into 2 bowls, setting them on the worn kitchen table. "I used to cook for 30 children before sunrise," she explained, finally meeting his eyes. "At the mission school where I taught." Donald sat down, watching. As she added a careful spoonful of precious sugar to each bowl. "You're a teacher?" Nalin nodded, her face softening at the memory. 3 years at Apache mission school. Teaching reading, writing, and numbers. She paused, stirring her breakfast, until Agent Hensley arrived. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the morning light growing stronger outside. Donald noticed her gaze repeatedly drifting to the satchel, which sat within arm's reach on a nearby chair. "Those papers seem mighty important to you," he said carefully, not wanting to press too hard. Nalin set down her spoon, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Something in his patient manner must have reassured her, because she reached for the satchel with decisive movements. "My father was wise in the ways of both worlds," she said, opening the worn leather flap. "He understood the power of white man's papers." From inside, she withdrew a carefully folded document, smoothing it on the table between them. The paper was weathered but intact, official seal still clearly visible. Donald leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles to read the flowing script. "It's a deed," he said slowly. "Granting grazing rights along Little Dry Creek, too." He squinted at the native name written there. "My father, John Walking Thunder," Nalin supplied. "And his descendants." Donald's eyes moved to the signatures at the bottom. His breath caught as he recognized one name in particular. "Captain James Blackwood," he read aloud. "Well, I'll be. You know this man?" Nalin asked sharply. Donald nodded. "Memories flooding back?" "Served with him briefly during the war before he trailed off, thoughts of James threatening to overwhelm him. He was a good man, honest. If he signed this, it's legitimate." He studied the carefully drawn map included. In the document, his rancher's eye quickly identifying the boundaries. The piece of land in question bordered his own property to the south, running along Little Dry Creek's vital water source. "This here," he said, tapping the paper gently, "this connects right to my grazing land. We're practically neighbors, according to this deed." Nalin's fingers traced the signature of Hurler. "These rights are sacred to us. The land, the water, they are life itself." Her voice hardened. "But Agent Hensley claims my father's death invalidates everything. Says a single woman can't hold grazing rights." Donald felt his jaw tighten. "That ain't right. Law's clear on inheritance, regardless of..." He stopped as Nalin's expression grew bitter. "Laws work differently for my people," she said quietly. "You know this?" He did know. Had seen too many similar injustices over the years, staying silent like most folks did. But something about this situation, the legitimate deed, Captain Blackwood's signature, the obvious corruption, stirred his conscience. "Still," he said, "with proper papers like these." A sound from outside drew their attention. Donald moved to the window, watching as several riders passed along the canyon trail in the distance. They carried surveying equipment, stopping occasionally to hammer stakes into the frozen ground. "Railroad men," he muttered, recognition dawning. "Been seeing more of them lately, marking routes through the territory." Nalin came to stand beside him, her body tense as she watched the surveyors. "Agent Hensley speaks often with railroad men. They meet in saloons, make plans they think no one sees." Donald understood the implication. Railroad companies were always hungry for land, especially along water sources like Little Dry Creek. An unscrupulous Indian agent could make good. Money helping them acquire unclaimed territory got they spent. The morning tending to ranch chores, Donald showing Nalin how to mix healing salve for Ashke's wounds. The Mustang was recovering well, already showing more spirit in his eyes. Nalin spoke softly to him in Apache as she worked, her gentle hands, earning the horse's trust. The short winter day was already waning when they returned to the house for supper. Donald had prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, with the last of yesterday's cornbread. As they ate, he could see Naleen's thoughts were still focused on the deed and its implications. "The circuit judge comes through town every month," he said finally, breaking the thoughtful silence. "Reckon he'd be interested in seeing those papers." Naleen looked up sharply. "You would help me bring this before a judge?" "For a judge?" Donald nodded slowly. "Way I see it, right. If we can prove Agent Hensley's corruption," he met her gaze steadily, "I'll stand witness to the deed's authenticity." "Speak to Captain Blackwood's character." Hope flickered in Naleen's eyes, though shadows of fear remained. She had clearly learned the hard way not to trust too easily or too quickly. But Donald saw her shoulders straighten, saw the same determination that had driven her to escape her captors. "When?" she asked simply. "Judge Crawford usually arrives first week of each month. That's in 3 days' time." Donald cleared there. "Plates?" Moving to stoke the fire against the growing evening chill. "We'll need to prepare careful-like. Get your story straight, gather any other proof we can find." Naleen nodded, her hand instinctively touching the satchel where the precious deed lay. "I've lived this truth my whole life. I am ready to speak it." The first fingers of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Donald Hart led his bay, gelding from the barn. Frost sparkled on fence posts and grass, the morning air sharp enough to steal breath. He worked methodically, checking each strap and buckle of the harness before hitching the wagon, his movements precise despite the cold. Inside the house, Naleen gathered the few possessions she had, most precious among them, the satchel containing her father's deed. Donald had given her his late wife's wool shawl the night before, a practical necessity against the winter chill. Now she wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, the soft gray fabric carrying the faint scent of cedar from years stored in his trunk. "Weather looks fair," Donald said as she emerged, though his eyes scanned the horizon with a rancher's practiced wariness. "Should hold through to town if we make good time." Naleen nodded, clutching the shawl closer. Behind the wagon, Ashke stood, quietly, his injured leg much improved. Donald had tethered him carefully, ensuring the Mustang could follow at an easy pace. The wagon creaked as they settled onto the wooden seat, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Donald clicked his tongue, and the bay stepped forward, wheels crunching through frozen mud and patches of snow. They passed through the gate, leaving the ranch behind as the sun crested the hills. The trail stretched before them, winding through winter-brown grassland and scattered pine. Their progress was steady, but unhurried, the wagon swaying gently over familiar ruts. As morning warmed toward noon, Naleen broke their comfortable silence. "My father believed education was the bridge between worlds," she said, her voice soft, but clear above the wagon's rhythm. "He dreamed of Apache children reading books while their families' herds grazed nearby. No more choosing between tradition and learning." Donald listened, hearing the pride and pain mingled in her words. "Sounds like a wise man, your father. He taught me to value both ways, Apache wisdom and white man's knowledge." Her fingers traced the edge of the satchel in her lap. "The mission school was part of that dream until they took it away." The wagon rolled on through stands of cottonwood, their bare branches reaching toward the pale winter sky. After a while, Donald found himself speaking of his own losses, words emerging like winter birds long kept silent. "Sarah, my wife. She took six winters back. Fever came on fast, nothing the doctor could do." He adjusted the reins, remembering. Our boy James was already gone by then. Gettysburg took him, along with so many others. Naleen's quiet presence beside him made the sharing easier somehow. "The house must feel very empty," she said simply. "Reckon it did." "Still does, sometimes." Donald watched the trail ahead, though lately it's felt a mite less so. They shared trail bread and dried apples as the sun climbed higher, the silence between them comfortable now, full of understanding rather than wariness. The bay plodded steadily onward, Ashke following behind like a faithful shadow dot by mid-afternoon. They approached Pete Miller's line camp, smoke rising from its stone chimney, Pete himself stood in the doorway, raising a hand in greeting as they drew near. "Donald Hart," he called out, walking to meet them. "Fair piece from home, ain't you?" "Heading to town?" Donald replied, drawing the wagon to a halt. "How are things out this way, Pete?" The older man's weathered face creased with concern. "Troublesome times, friend. Railroad's been buying up land all around. Mighty cheap, too. Considering? Them as won't sell seem to have accidents, if you take my meaning. Hired guns?" Donald asked, though he already knew the answer. Pete nodded grimly. "Saw 3 of them riding through yesterday. Winchesters across their saddles. Word is they're working for that railroad foreman, Boone." He glanced at Nolan, then back to Donald. "Best watch yourself, neighbor." They thanked Pete for the warning and continued on, the wagon wheels leaving fresh tracks in the afternoon snow. Donald's thoughts turned heavy, connecting pieces of an unsettling puzzle: the railroad surveyors, Agent Hensley's corruption, and now armed men pressuring landowners. The winter sun was settling toward the horizon when they finally crested the last ridge above town. Below them, Millwood spread out along the creek, a collection of wooden buildings and rutted streets. Smoke rose from chimneys in the gathering dusk, and the Methodist church bell tolled the evening hour, its clear notes carrying on the still air. Donald guided the wagon down the main street, past the general store and telegraph office, both already closed for the day. The livery stable stood at the far end, its doors still open to receive late arrivals. "We'll stable the horses here," he said, turning in. "The boarding house across the way is clean and respectable. Mrs. Wheeler runs a proper place." The stable boy helped them unhitch while Donald arranged for care of both the bay and Ashkie. Nallen gathered her few belongings, the satchel held close, as they crossed the street to the 2-story boarding house. Mrs. Wheeler, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile, showed them to a small but tidy room on the second floor. Donald paid for 2 nights, explaining he would take a spot in the livery loft. "It's proper warm up there," he assured Nolan, seeing her concerned look. "Done it before when weather's caught me in town." After seeing her settled, Donald returned to the stable to arrange his own sleeping place. The loft was indeed warm, the heat from the horses below rising through the floorboards. He spread his bedroll in a quiet corner, tired from the long days. Journey. Just as sleep began to take him, voices drifted up from below. 2 men had entered the stable, speaking in low tones that nevertheless carried in the night quiet. "Boone says the rail spurs got to run through that creek land," one voice said. "Water access is key to the whole deal." "What about them, Indian?" "Claims?" the second man asked. "Heard there was some kind of deed. Agent Hensley's handling that end. Says there won't be any problem once the hearing's done." A match struck, tobacco smoke wafting up through the boards. "By spring, that whole stretch will be clear for construction." Donald lay still, listening as the men finished their cigarettes and departed. Their words confirmed his worst fears about the scope of the corruption they faced. This was larger than just Nalan's grazing rights. It was a calculated plan to steal land for the railroad's expansion. Through the loft window, he could see lights still burning in the boarding house across the street. Somewhere in there, Nalin was likely lying awake as well, her father's precious deed close at hand. Tomorrow they would face the circuit judge. But now Donald understood just how much was aligned against them. The night grew deeper, and one by one the town's windows went dark. Only the stars remained bright, scattered across the winter sky like distant campfires, keeping their own counsel about what the coming day might bring. Golden sunlight streamed through the church's tall windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden pews. Donald adjusted his collar, uncomfortable in his Sunday best, as he and Nallen walked up the steps of the Methodist church. She wore Sarah's old dress, carefully mended, and carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the turning heads and hushed voices that followed their entrance. "Folks sure ain't subtle with their staring," Donald murmured, guiding her to a pew near the back. The whispers followed them like autumn leaves in a breeze. "Who's that Indian woman?" With Donald Hart of all people, in church, no less. The church bell tolled its final call, and Reverend Thompson stepped to the pulpit, his stern face softening as he surveyed his congregation. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he opened his Bible. Today, his voice rang clear through the hushed sanctuary. We speak of justice. His eyes swept across the gathered faces. Not the justice of men with its changeable laws and convenient exceptions, but God's justice, pure, unchanging, and blind to the distinctions we mortals make among ourselves. Donald noticed several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Reverend continued, his words measured and strong. "The Lord executes justice for the oppressed," he quoted, "and gives food to the hungry. These are not mere suggestions, brothers and sisters, but commands. When we see injustice, we are called to act. Throughout the sermon, Donald felt Nalene sitting perfectly still beside him, her hands folded in her lap. He wondered what she made of this white man's church, with its painted crosses and leather-bound Bibles. After the service, while most folks hurried out to their Sunday gatherings, Donald led Nell in to meet Reverend Thompson. The preacher stood by the altar gathering his papers, but looked up with genuine welcome as they approached. "Reverend," Donald said, "I'd like you to meet Miss Nallen. She taught at the Apache mission school until recently." "Welcome, Miss Nallen," Thompson said warmly, extending his hand. "Any teacher of children is welcome in this house of worship." Quietly, they shared her story. The grazing rights, her father's service as a scout, Agent Hensley's corruption. The Reverend listened intently, his expression growing grave. "These papers should be presented to the county clerk immediately," he said finally. "I'll accompany you myself. The law may be imperfect, but it must be our first recourse." They found the clerk, Mr. Peterson, at his home, where he often received official business on Sundays. The small man peered at them through wire-rimmed spectacles, his initial surprise at seeing Nellen giving way to professional attention as he examined the deed. "These signatures appear genuine," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I can schedule a hearing for Tuesday morning. Judge Parker will want to review this himself." He made careful notes in his ledger. 10 o'clock sharp, at the courthouse. By the time they left the clerk's house, word was already spreading through town. Donald could see people gathering in small groups, heads bent in discussion. Some faces showed open scorn, others uncertainty, and a few, mostly older folks, who remembered her father, showed something like support. The day passed slowly, and evening found them at the boarding house supper table. Mrs. Wheeler had laid out a proper Sunday meal, roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. But the usual comfortable chatter was replaced by tense silence and sidelong glances. "Ain't natural," a drummer from Kansas muttered just loud enough to be heard, "letting Indians claim white folks' land. That land was granted legal and proper," Donald said firmly, his voice carrying across the table. "Many here might remember John Ruddingwolf, who served as scout for the cavalry. Saved more than a few soldiers' lives, including Colonel Matthews himself." He looked around the table. "This is his daughter, educated at the mission school, where she taught our children alongside yours." The silence that followed felt heavy as storm clouds. Nallen sat straight back, her face composed, though Donald could see her hands trembling slightly beneath the table. Later, as they stood on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Nallen finally spoke of the day's trials. "I feared they would mock me openly," she admitted softly, "that I would bring shame to my father's memory by failing him." "You did him proud today," Donald assured her. "Standing with dignity ain't failing, no matter what folks might say." "You didn't have to defend me," she said, looking at him directly. "It could make trouble for you." "Reckon some things are worth trouble." Donald shifted his weight, considering his words carefully. "I'll stand with you through this hearing, Miss Nellen. That's a promise." Across the street, the saloon's swinging doors opened, spilling lamplight onto the dusty road. Silas Boone, the railroad foreman, stepped out with Charles Hensley, the Indian agent. They stood in the shadows, heads close together in conversation. Though their words didn't carry, their furtive manner spoke clear enough. Donald watched them disappear around the corner, his jaw set. The sight of those two together confirmed his worst suspicions. They were plotting something. And Tuesday's hearing would be anything but simple. The last light faded from the sky, and the evening star appeared, bright and steady above the darkening town. From the church, Reverend Thompson's words about justice echoed in Donald's mind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had taken the first step toward making things right. Mrs. Wheeler's voice called from inside, announcing that she was locking up for the night. Donald tipped his hat to Nalin, who smiled softly before disappearing inside. He stood a moment longer, watching the lights go out one by one in the boarding house windows, while across the street, the saloon continued its busy trade, unaware or uncaring of the storm brewing in this small frontier town. Monday dawned clear and crisp, the morning frost melting quickly under the bright winter sun. Donald made his way to the livery stable, where the familiar sense of hay and leather greeted him. He settled into the rhythm of working with the worn tack, his skilled fingers mending tears and replacing brittle straps. The creak of leather and clink of metal. Buckles filled the quiet barn as he worked. His thoughts drifted to tomorrow's hearing, wondering if justice would prevail in a town where railroad money spoke louder than signed deeds. Still, he had given his word to stand with Nalin, and Donald Hart never broke a promise. Through the open stable door, he could see the boarding house porch across the street. Nalin sat there in Sarah's old rocking chair, a slate balanced on her lap. 3 children gathered around her feet, the Wheeler kids and young Tommy from the general store. Their faces showed eager concentration as Nalin drew letters with the chalk, her voice carrying softly across the morning air. "Nal, what sound does this make?" she asked, pointing to the slate. "That's the sound, ma'am." Little Mary Wheeler chirped, bouncing on her toes. "Very good," Nalin praised, her smile gentle. "Now, who could write it?" Donald noticed Mrs. Peterson, the clerk's wife, pause on her way to the mercantile, watching the impromptu lesson. The sharp suspicion on her face slowly softened as she observed Nalin's patient teaching. Other townsfolk stopped too, their usual hurried pace slowing as they passed the porch. "She's got away with them young uns," old Sam from the hardware store commented, leaning on the livery door frame. "Reminds me of that mission school teacher we had a few years back, the one who taught my grandson his letters." Donald nodded, working saddle soap into a cracked rein. "She taught at the mission before the new agent came. Seems to me teaching's in her blood." By mid-morning, more children had joined the group on the porch, drawn by the novelty of a new teacher. Mrs. Wheeler brought out a pitcher of lemonade and cookies, her earlier reserve thawing in the face of Nalin's gentle manner, the little ones. The sun climbed higher, and Donald finished the last of the repairs. He washed up at the pump, then crossed the street just as Nalin was dismissing her impromptu class. Time for the clerk's office, he reminded her quietly. They walked together down the dusty main street toward the courthouse, where Mr. Peterson waited in his cramped office. The clerk adjusted his spectacles as they entered, gesturing to the wooden chairs before his desk. "Now then," he said, pulling out the deed papers. "Let's have your formal testimony about these documents, Miss Nalin." She spoke clearly, explaining how her father had earned grazing rights through his service to the cavalry. Her fingers traced the familiar signature at the bottom. Colonel Matthews, the officer who had trusted John Runningwolf with his life more than once. Peterson frowned thoughtfully at the cavalry officer's bold scroll. "If Colonel Matthews verifies his signature, you'll have a strong case," he admitted. "The judge respects his word." He made careful notes in his ledger, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the quiet office dot as they left the courthouse. Donald suggested they ride out to check the disputed pasture. They borrowed horses from the livery and took the north trail, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. But as they crested the rise overlooking Little Dry Creek, Donald reined in sharply, his body T-N-S and G dot below them. 3 railroad men moved methodically across the pasture, hammering survey stakes into the ground. Each strike of their hammers seemed to mock the legal papers in Nalin's satchel. Donald's hands tightened on the reins, fury rising in his chest. Those stakes were more than wood and metal. They were the railroad's way of marking their territory, regardless of who held rightful claim to the land. Before he could spur his horse forward, Nolan's hand touched his arm. The gentle pressure carried more strength than steel. "Violence won't win this fight," she said softly. "We must trust in the law as my father did." Donald forced his breathing to slow, knowing she was right. Still, it took all his self-control to turn away from the sight of those men claiming what wasn't theirs to take. They rode back to town as the sun began its descent, the evening air growing sharp with coming frost. At the boarding house, Mrs. Wheeler surprised them by inviting them both to share supper in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. "Less crowded back here," she said with a meaningful look, ladling rich beef stew into their bowls. "And more peaceful-like. The kitchen was warm and homey, filled with the scents of fresh bread and coffee. Nolan sat quietly for a moment, then began to pray in her native tongue, the musical words flowing like water over stones, though Donald couldn't understand. Words, their reverent tone touched something deep within him. A sense of peace settled over him. Unexpected but welcome that Mrs. Wheeler busied herself with the dishes. But Donald noticed her pause in her work, listening with something like wonder to the unfamiliar prayer. Outside the kitchen's yellow lamplight, unknown to those within, Silas Boone gathered his men in the shadows behind the saloon. "The railroad?" Foreman's voice was low and hard as he handed out money to 3 hired guns. "Tomorrow's hearing never happens," he ordered. "Make sure of it tonight, but keep it quiet. No shooting unless you have to. Just get those papers and make it clear what happens to Indians who don't know their place." The gunman nodded, dirty fingers counting blood money, while their employer melted back into the saloon's noisy depths. They would wait for full dark, when the town slept and only the coyotes would witness their work. Inside the warm kitchen, Donald watched Nolan gather the empty bowls, her movements graceful and sure. The day had brought small victories, children learning, townspeople softening, the clerk's cautious support. But tomorrow would test them all, and the railroad stakes and the pasture were only the visible sign of the opposition. They faced. Mrs. Wheeler shooed them both out of her kitchen, insisting she could manage the washing up herself. "You two rest now," she said. "Sounds like tomorrow's going to be a mighty important day." They stepped onto the back porch, where the evening star had already appeared in the darkening sky. Donald found himself listening to the night sounds of the small town, dogs barking in distant yards, the saloon piano playing a tinny tune, footsteps on wooden sidewalks. Somewhere in those familiar sounds, danger waited. But for now, there was just the peace of a winter evening and the quiet strength of the woman beside him. Dawn crept over the town, painting the courthouse windows with pale gold light. Inside the clerk's office, bodies pressed together as townsfolk squeezed in, their breath fogging the cold glass. The small room, usually empty save for Peterson and his ledgers, now hummed with whispered conversations and shuffling boots. Nolan stood before the clerk's desk, her spine straight as a pine sapling. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow. Shadows, but her eyes shone with quiet determination. Donald noticed how she held her father's satchel close. Like a shield against the stares of the crowd, Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs. "We're here to review the land claim of Miss Nolan, daughter of John Running Wolf, regarding grazing rights along Little Dry Creek." He adjusted his spectacles, hands steady as he opened the deed papers. "Miss Nolan, please tell us how these rights came to your family." Her voice carried clear and strong through the stuffy room. "My father served as scout for Colonel Matthews in the 5th Cavalry for 15 years. He guided them through Apache territory, saved many soldiers' lives." She touched the papers gently. "The colonel trusted him, called him brother. When father asked for grazing rights to protect our people's future, the colonel signed this deed himself." Donald watched faces in the crowd. Some softened at the mention of military service, while others remained hard as winter ground. Mrs. Wheeler dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief when Nolan spoke of her father's death. How he had made her promise to keep teaching the children. "Mr. Hart." Peterson's voice cut through the tension. You found Miss Nowlin on your property. Please tell us the circumstances. Donald stepped forward, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. Found her 3 days ago, tied beneath a Mustang near death. His words came slow but clear, painting the scene of that bitter afternoon. She had papers proving her claim, signed and witness proper. Someone tried mighty hard to keep her from reaching this hearing. A ripple passed through the crowd. Sam, from the hardware store, muttered, "Ain't right, treating no one that way, Indian or not." Peterson examined the documents again, holding them up to the morning light. The official seal gleamed red against the yellowed paper. The deed appears genuine. Colonel Matthew's signature matches our records. He straightened in his chair. Pending the colonel's personal confirmation, I declare this claim provisionally valid. Miss Nowlin holds legal grazing rights to the designated portion of Little Dry Creek. The crowd erupted in mixed reactions. Mrs. Wheeler clapped briefly before catching herself. The railroad men at the back pushed out, faces dark with anger. But most folk just looked surprised, as if seeing Nowlin properly for the first time. Donald guided her through the pressing bodies out into the crisp morning air. Without speaking, they walked to the whitewashed church where Reverend Thompson waited on the steps. The old preacher's eyes crinkled with warmth as they approached. Come in, he said, holding the heavy door. Inside, morning light streamed. Through simple windows, making the wooden pews glow, the Reverend led them to the altar rail, where he placed one hand on Nowlin's bowed head. Lord, his voice resonated in the quiet space. Bless this daughter's courage. Guide her path with justice and mercy. He paused, then added softly, and bless those who stand beside her in righteousness. A few early parishioners had followed them in. As the Reverend finished his prayer, they hummed gentle approval. Mrs. Peterson, who had watched Nowlin teach the children, stepped forward to squeeze her hand. The day passed in a blur of congratulations and paperwork. By evening, Donald and Nowlin sat in the boarding house kitchen, sharing coffee and the first real peace they had known since meeting. The lamp cast warm shadows on the walls as they talked, tension finally easing from their shoulders. Perhaps, Nowlin said, turning her cup slowly, I could start a proper school. Something small, near the creek. Her eyes lit up. The children here need teaching, same as at the mission. Donald found himself chuckling. Reckon they do. Saw how they took to you yesterday. The sound of his own laugh surprised him. When was the last time he had felt this light? You're laughing at me? Nowlin's mock offense dissolved into her own soft laughter. Not at you, Donald assured her. Just thinking how much has changed since I found you in that storm. They sat in comfortable silence, playing aloud, a schoolhouse built of local pine, grazing land shared fairly. A future neither had imagined. Possible just days ago, the midnight bell was tolling when the first shouts of fire split the darkness. Donald bolted upright in his boarding house bed, the smell of smoke already seeping under his door. He grabbed his coat and ran downstairs, out into the freezing night. Orange flames leaped from the livery stable, painting the sky with hellish light. The horses! Someone yelled. Donald sprinted toward the burning building, his heart pounding. Inside, he could hear terrified whinnies over the roar of flames. Through the smoke, he saw his wagon already engulfed, the barn gear he had so carefully repaired now feeding the inferno. But worse was the sound that cut through the chaos. Ashke's frightened cry from the back stall. Hold the bucket line, Donald shouted to the gathering townsmen. He wrapped his coat around his face and plunged into the stable. Heat seared his lungs as he fought through the smoke toward Nowlin's horse. Ashke reared in panic, eyes rolling white in the flames. Donald reached for the lead rope, trying to guide the terrified animal toward the door. But a burning beam crashed, down, missing them by inches. The horse screamed, a sound that would haunt Donald's dreams. Dome, Reverend Thompson's voice cut through the roar. Get out now. The roof's going. Donald tried one last time to reach Ashke, but the flames drove him back. Rough hands pulled him from the doorway, just as the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. He fell to his knees in the snow, coughing, watching helplessly. as the stable became a pyre. A soft cry made him turn. Nellen stood in a nightdress and shawl, Mrs. Wheeler's arm around her shoulders. In the firelight, tears tracked down her face as she watched her faithful horse, her last link to her father's world, disappear into the flames. The bucket brigade worked through the night. But by dawn, only smoking ruins remained. Donald's wagon, his tack, and worst of all, Ashki, all destroyed. The message was clear as the sunrise painting the ashes red. Someone would stop at nothing to drive them away. As townsfolk gathered in the gray morning light, Donald saw rage and shame on many faces. This was more than an attack on property. It was a strike at the heart of their community's honor. Mrs. Wheeler brought coffee and blankets. Her earlier hesitation transformed to fierce protectiveness. Reverend Thompson stood in the smoke-filled street, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "The Lord sees all," he declared. "Those who work in darkness cannot hide from his light." Donald found Nellen standing alone by the ruins, her hand outstretched toward the charred beams where Ashki had perished. Without words, he placed his coat around her shoulders. They stood together as smoke billowed into the winter sky, their shared silence heavy with grief and determination. The pale winter dawn crept over the smoking ruins of the livery stable. Donald Hart stood beside the grave he had dug in the frozen earth, his shovel striking hard against roots and stones. Each impact echoed his determination, even as his muscles ached from the night's battle with the fire. Beside him, Nellen knelt. In the snow, her shoulders wrapped in Mrs. Wheeler's thick shawl, Ashki's body lay before them, pulled from the charred wreckage. The proud Mustang that had carried Nellen to safety now rested beneath a blanket, waiting for its final rest. Donald paused, leaning on his shovel, watching as Nellen touched the horse's singed mane one last time. He was more than just a horse. She whispered, her voice rough with grief. "He carried my father's memory, our hopes." Snowflakes drifted down, settling on her dark hair like scattered stars. Donald nodded, understanding loss too well. "We'll lay him proper, facing the sunrise." He resumed digging, each thrust of the shovel measured and steady. Other townsfolk gathered at a respectful distance. Mrs. Wheeler, Sam from the hardware store, even old Mr. Peterson from the clerk's office. When the grave was deep enough, Donald helped lower Ashki's body. Nellen sprinkled tobacco and sage over the blanket, murmuring words in Apache that seemed to float on the morning air. Her tears fell silently, freezing before they reached the ground. "Your father would be proud," Donald said softly, beginning to fill the grave. "Proud of your courage, your faith and justice." Reverend Thompson stepped forward, his Bible open despite the falling snow. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, his voice carrying across the stillness. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." As the grave filled, the sun broke through winter clouds, casting long shadows across the new fallen snow. Donald set the last stones in place, marking the spot where a faithful horse rested beneath the open sky. "We won't be broken," Donald promised, helping Nellen to her feet. "Whoever did this, they don't know the strength that comes from standing." Together, they walked back toward town, the small crowd dispersing ahead of them. At the boarding house steps, Mrs. Wheeler waited with hot coffee and fresh biscuits. "You both need warming," she insisted, ushering them inside. They had barely settled at the kitchen table when running footsteps approached. Young Tommy burst through the door, waving a yellow paper. "Mr. Peterson says, come quick, news from the telegraph office." At the clerk's office, Mr. Peterson held the telegram with trembling hands. "Just arrived," he announced, from Colonel Matthews himself. He cleared his throat and read, "Confirmed deed authentic stop. Nellen holds legal claim stop. Will arrive 3 days to testify stop." The small room erupted in celebration. Mrs. Wheeler embraced Nellen while Sam pumped Donald's hand. Even Mr. Peterson smiled broadly, stamping the telegram with an official seal. "It's done then," Donald said, relief flooding through him. "The land is yours, legal and proper?" Nellen pressed her hands together, eyes shining with grateful tears. But their joy proved tragically brief. That night, as darkness settled over the sleeping town, heavy boots crashed up the boarding house stairs. Donald, dozing in a chair by Nolan's door, barely had time to stand before the first punch landed. 5 men, faces hidden by bandanas, stormed the hallway. "No," Donald shouted, throwing himself at the nearest attacker. His fist connected with jaw, but another man struck him from behind. He heard Nolan's door splinter, her cry of defiance cut short. Donald fought desperately, taking down one man, then another. But a gun butt crashed against his temple, and darkness swallowed him. He woke to gentle hands dabbing his forehead. "Reverend." Thompson's concerned face swam into focus above him. Donald lay on a church pew, morning light streaming through stained glass. "Easy now," the Reverend cautioned as Donald tried to sit up. "That's quite a knock you took. Nalene?" Donald's voice was hoarse. "Where is she?" The Reverend's face darkened. "Taken. Witnesses saw them riding toward the railroad camp up Lightning Creek Way." He helped Donald sit up slowly. "Marshall's out of town till tomorrow. No law to help us." Donald touched his temple, fingers coming away bloody. Rage and guilt warred in his chest. "I failed her. Should have been ready." "You fought like a lion," Mrs. Wheeler said from nearby. She held a basin of bloody water against 5 armed men. "Nearly got yourself killed." Donald stood carefully, testing his balance. His gun belt hung on a nearby pew. He buckled it on with determined movements. "You're going after her." The Reverend's words were not a question. "They mean to force her to sign away the land." Donald sighed, checking his revolver. "Or worse." "You'll be outnumbered," Mrs. Wheeler warned. "Those railroad men don't fight fair." Donald strode toward the church door, but Reverend Thompson's voice stopped him. "Don't fight hate with hate, Donald." The old preacher's eyes were intense. "Fight it with truth." Donald's hand tightened on his gun grip. "Truth?" He laughed bitterly. "Truth didn't stop them burning the stable. Truth didn't protect Nolan. Truth is stronger than bullets," the Reverend insisted, "when wielded with mercy." He stepped closer. "Remember what you're fighting for. Justice, not vengeance." Donald stood in the doorway, snow falling harder now, coating the street in white silence. The trail would be difficult to follow, but he knew where they were headed. His heart burned with purpose, yet the Reverend's words echoed in his mind. "I'll bring her back," he promised, swinging into his saddle. "One way or another." Mrs. Wheeler pressed a bundle of food into his saddlebag. "God go with you," she whispered. The snow fell thicker as Donald rode out of town. The railroad camp a day's hard ride north. The weather would hide his approach, but it also veiled the kidnapper's trail. Still, determination drove him forward. Somewhere ahead, Nalin needed him. And this time, he would not fail her. The Reverend's final words followed him into the storm. "Fight it with truth." Donald touched, his gun and his father's old Bible in his coat pocket. The choice between justice and vengeance lay ahead. Wrapped in swirling snow and growing darkness dot his horse's hooves broke fresh trails and a deepening white, carrying him toward a confrontation that would test not just his courage but the very nature of his faith. The snow fell steadier now, as if nature herself tried to cleanse the violence from the land. The snow swirled thick around Donald, as he crouched behind a frost-covered boulder, studying the railroad camp below. His hands, stiff with cold, gripped his father's old spyglass. 6 canvas tents glowed golden in the gathering dusk, lantern light spilling onto trampled snow. His breath frosted in the air as he counted the armed men, 2 by the supply wagon, 2 patrolling the perimeter, and 2 more warming themselves by a crackling fire. Through the spyglass lens, he spotted Nolan. She sat bound in the supply wagon, her head held high despite the rope around her wrists. A canvas tarp partially covered the wagon, offering meager shelter from the bitter wind. Even from this distance, Donald could see the stubborn set of her jaw. She hadn't been broken, Silas. Boone's voice carried on the wind as he emerged from the largest tent, gesturing sharply at his men. "Keep her secure. By morning she'll be ready to sign." The railroad foreman's threat made Donald's fingers tighten on his rifle, but wisdom held him back. 6 armed men against 1 would end badly as darkness deepened. Donald retreated down the ridge, leading his horse carefully through deepening snow. The mare's hooves made soft crunching sounds despite his caution. His mind raced, weighing options. A frontal assault would be suicide. Stealth alone wasn't enough. He needed help. The church windows glowed warm against the night as Donald tied his horse outside. Inside, Reverend Thompson looked up from his Bible, unsurprised. "You found her?" "6. Armed men," Donald said, stamping snow from his boots. "They're holding her in a supply wagon, waiting for morning, likely planning to force her signature on some papers." The Reverend closed his Bible slowly. "And you're here because you've realized you can't do this alone." "I need help," Donald admitted. "Good people will stand for what's right, then let's gather them." The Reverend pulled on his coat. "Sam Wheeler's place first. He's got 5. Hands will fight fair. Then the Peterson boys. Maybe old Jim Tucker." They moved through town, knocking on doors, speaking in low voices. Some turned them away, fears of railroad revenge stronger than conscience. But others listened. In Sam Wheeler's warm kitchen, 5 ranch hands nodded grimly at Donald's words. The Peterson brothers, loading shells into shotguns, spoke of their own battles with railroad men back in Kansas. Mrs. Wheeler appeared with coffee and bread, her face set with determination. "I'm coming too," she announced. "You'll need someone to tend wounds. God forbid." By midnight, 14 people crowded the church basement. Donald spread a rough map on the table, marking the camp's location with a pencil. "They've got the high ground," he explained, "but the snow works for us. Covers sound, hides movement." "What's the plan?" Sam Wheeler asked, cleaning his revolver. Donald traced routes on the map. "We split into 3 groups. First group creates a diversion, maybe a false attack from the north. Second group cuts off their escape route south. Third group, that's me and 4 others. We get to Nowlin while they're distracted." "And then?" someone asked. "We bring her back to town," Reverend Thompson said firmly. "Where witnesses can see what they've done. Let justice work in the light." They hammered out details by lantern light. Mrs. Wheeler prepared bandages while her husband distributed extra ammunition. The Peterson boys knew the terrain best. They'd lead the southern group. Old Jim Tucker, despite his limp, insisted on joining the diversion team. Donald felt the weight of their trust as they planned. These were his neighbors, risking their lives and livelihoods. If things went wrong, he pushed the thought away, focusing instead on Nolan's courage, her unwavering faith in justice. "Remember," Reverend Thompson addressed them all, "we're not here for vengeance. We're here for justice, for what's right." They prayed together, then dispersed to gather horses and supplies. The snow had stopped, leaving a deep silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the soft nickering of horses being saddled. Donald checked his rifle one last time, then mounted up. Around him, shapes emerged from the darkness. His neighbors, bundled against the cold, determination in every line of their bodies. Mrs. Wheeler sat straight in her saddle, medical bag secured behind her. The Peterson boys led their group, south, moving like shadows through the snow. They rode in silence, the eastern horizon barely hinting at dawn. The snow creaked beneath their horses' hooves, each sound seeming impossibly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Above them, stars began fading as the sky lightened degree by degree. Donald raised his hand, signaling a halt as they neared the camp. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see smoke rising from the railroad men's fire. The canvas tents stood like pale ghosts in the dim light. Most importantly, the supply wagon remained where he'd last seen it, Nowlin's dark figure still visible. Within, he motioned the diversion team north, watched them disappear into the trees. The southern group was already in position, waiting. Donald turned to his own team, Sam Wheeler, 2 of his hands, and young Billy Peterson with his father's old Spencer rifle. "Remember," Donald whispered, "wait for the signal." Then straight. "To the wagon? No shooting unless there's no choice." They nodded, their breath frosting in the strengthening light. Dawn painted the snow pink as they waited, every second stretching like pulled taffy. Donald's heart thundered in his chest. He thought of Nalin, of her quiet strength, of the trust in her eyes when she'd shared her father's story. The horizon glowed brighter, promising another day. But first, they had to see justice done. Donald checked his pocket watch in the growing light. Any moment now, the signal would come. Any moment, they would act. His fingers tightened on his reins as the first rays of sun touched the eastern hills. The camp below stirred with morning activity. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. They waited, ready to move. As the new day crept closer, the first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered hills in shades of rose and gold. Reverend Thompson adjusted his collar, clutched his weathered Bible close, and began walking openly toward the railroad camp. His boots crunched in the fresh snow as he raised his voice in morning prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His words carried clearly across the crisp air. The guards tensed, rifles raising. "Hold it right there, preacher." Reverend Thompson smiled gently, holding up his Bible. "I've come to share the morning word with souls in need of guidance." He continued forward, unhurried. "For it is written, what profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?" While the guard's attention fixed on the preacher, Donald, and two ranchers, Sam Wheeler and young Billy Peterson, crept through the shadows behind the supply wagons. Their boots made soft impressions in the snow as they moved with careful precision. Donald's heart hammered as they neared the wagon, where Nalin sat bound. Through gaps in the canvas, he could see her huddled form, shoulders straight despite the cold. Her eyes met his through the opening, widening slightly in recognition. But she gave no other sign. Sam Wheeler positioned himself as lookout while Donald worked at the ropes binding Nalin's wrists. The hemp was stiff with frost, requiring careful manipulation to avoid drawing attention. Behind them, Reverend Thompson's voice rose and fell in measured cadence, speaking of redemption and judgment. "The wages of sin is death," the Reverend proclaimed, drawing closer to the main group of guards. "But the gift of God is eternal life." Just as Donald severed the last rope, a sharp voice cut through the morning air. "Hey, behind the wagon." The crack of a rifle shot shattered the dawn silence. A bullet splintered wood near Donald's head as he pulled Nalin down. More shots followed, the air filling with the sharp report of gunfire and shouts of alarm. "Get her clear," Sam Wheeler yelled, returning fire as Donald half-carried. Half-guided Nalin toward better cover. Behind a stack of railroad ties, the morning erupted into chaos. From the north and south, townspeople emerged from hiding. Farmers with rifles, ranchers on horseback, even old Jim Tucker with his ancient shotgun. The hired gunmen found themselves caught in crossfire, their confident swagger replaced by confusion. "Don't let them escape," someone shouted as two of the guards tried breaking for their horses. Donald kept Nalin close, shielding her with his body as they moved from cover to cover. A bullet kicked up snow beside them. Another cracked against the frozen ground. But the hired guns were too busy defending themselves against the unexpected assault from multiple directions to focus on their escaped prisoner. Through the smoke and confusion, Donald spotted Charles Hensley, the Indian agent, trying to slip away toward a saddled horse. The man's fancy coat was covered in snow as he scrambled through the camp. "Keep going," Donald told Nalin, gesturing toward where Mrs. Wheeler waited with a wagon. "I need to finish this." Donald intercepted Hensley just as the agent reached for his horse's reins. The corrupt official spun around, drawing a small pistol from his coat. "Paper means nothing here," Hensley sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "This is railroad land now." Donald moved faster than the agent expected, knocking the gun aside as it fired harmlessly into the air. They grappled in the snow, Hensley's fine clothes offering little protection against the cold ground. Despite the fury burning in his chest, Donald remembered Reverend Thompson's words about mercy. When he finally pinned Hensley down, he reached, not for his gun, but for a length of rope at his belt. "The law means something," Donald said firmly as he bound the agent's hands. "And so do people's rights." Around them, the shooting had largely ceased. Most of the hired guns had fled, leaving their weapons and supplies behind. Those who remained were being rounded up by townspeople, their hands raised in surrender. The morning sun now stood clear of the horizon, revealing the aftermath of the brief battle. Steam rose from horses' flanks and men's breath clouded the air. Remarkably, no one appeared seriously hurt. A few cuts and bruises, one grazed arm being tended by Mrs. Wheeler. Reverend Thompson stood calmly in the center of the camp, his Bible still in hand. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes twinkled as he watched Donald leading the bound Indian agent toward the waiting wagons. Donald found Nalin by Mrs. Wheeler's wagon, wrapped in a thick blanket. But standing tall, her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and lingering concern as she watched the last of the hired guns being secured. "You came for me?" she said softly as Donald approached. "All of you. Couldn't leave you to face this alone." Donald replied, gentle despite his exhaustion. He helped her mount his horse, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "These are your neighbors now. We look after our own." The rising sun cast long shadows across the trampled snow as the townspeople began gathering evidence of the agents. Crimes, forged documents, threatening letters, records of stolen land. The railroad camp stood silent now except for the wind in the canvas tents and the soft sounds of horses being hitched to wagons. Donald watched as Sam Wheeler and his sons secured the Indian agent in a wagon for the ride back to town. Hensley's fine clothes were dirty and torn now, his arrogant manner replaced by sullen silence. Justice, it seemed, could wear many faces. Reverend Thompson approached, snow dusting his shoulders. "Not a single life lost," he said quietly. "The Lord is merciful indeed. Indeed." "And so were we," Donald replied, thinking of how close he'd come to choosing a different path. The morning light strengthened as they prepared to return to town. Donald mounted behind Nalin, securing her against the cold. Around them, their neighbors, farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, all ordinary people who had chosen to stand for what was right, gathered their horses and wagons for the journey home. The wind had died down, leaving the world crystal clear and new-made. As they rode away from the abandoned camp, Donald felt Nalin lean back slightly against him, exhausted but safe at last. Behind them, the sun continued its climb into the winter sky, promising a new day and the hope of justice yet to come. The wagon train stretched along the snowy trail as they approached town. Wheels creaking through fresh powder, Donald rode beside the supply wagon, where Sheriff Calloway kept watch over the bound Indian agent. Nalin sat tall on Donald's horse, her eyes fixed on the church steeple rising above the rooftops ahead. The morning sun caught the cross atop the steeple, making it shine like a beacon. As they drew closer, the church bell began to toll, its clear notes rolling across the winter landscape. The sound drew townsfolk from their homes and businesses, curious faces appearing in doorways and windows. "Word travels fast," Reverend Thompson remarked, riding up alongside Donald. "The Lord's timing is perfect. The whole town will witness justice being done." The wagons rolled down Main Street, past the general store, where Mrs. Tucker stood with her hands clasped. The blacksmith stepped out of his shop, hammer still in hand. Even the saloon emptied as men crowded onto the wooden sidewalk to watch the procession. They halted before the church, where a crowd had already begun to gather. Donald dismounted first, helping Nalin down with gentle hands. She stood straight despite her exhaustion, facing the townspeople with quiet dignity. The agent, Charles Hensley, was pulled from the wagon, his fine clothes now mud-stained and torn. "Bring him inside," Reverend Thompson called out, mounting the church steps. "Let all witness what happens when greed attempts to overrule God's justice." The congregation filed in behind them, boots stamping snow from their feet on the wooden steps. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting rainbow patterns through the colored glass onto the worn floorboards. The pews filled quickly as Donald led Nalin to the front row. Sheriff Calloway and 2 deputies escorted. Hensley to stand before the altar rail. Reverend Thompson raised his hands for silence. The murmuring crowd grew still as he unfolded a yellow telegram paper. Brothers and sisters, his voice rang clear. In the hushed church, I hold their confirmation from Colonel James Winchester, 7th Cavalry, verifying the authenticity of Miss Nallen's deed to the grazing lands along Little Dry Creek. He paused, letting the words settle. I will read his words exactly as received. The paper crackled as he smoothed it open. To whom it may concern, I, Colonel James Winchester, do hereby confirm that on the 15th of May, 1872, I personally witnessed and signed the deed granting grazing rights to Running Wolf and his heirs in perpetuity. The document held by his daughter bears my true signature and the full authority of the United States Army. A murmur rippled through the church. Donald watched Nallen's shoulders straighten further, her chin lifting as the colonel's words validated her father's trust in the white man's law. Furthermore, Reverend Thompson continued, voice strengthening, any attempt to invalidate or seize these legally granted rights shall be considered a violation of federal law and treaty obligations. Signed, Colonel James Winchester, Fort Richardson, Texas. The Reverend lowered the telegram, looking directly at the bound agent. Mr. Hensley, you stand accused of attempting to steal land rightfully deeded to this woman and her people. How do you answer before God and these witnesses? Hensley's face twisted in a sneer. That land belongs to Progress, to the railroad. You can't stop. That'll do. Sheriff Calloway cut him off, stepping forward. Charles Hensley, I'm placing you under formal arrest for attempted theft of deeded property, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit violence against the citizens of this county. The sheriff's weathered face was stern as he produced a pair of iron handcuffs. You'll face the circuit judge when he arrives next week. From the back of the church came an angry shout. This is an outrage. The railroad foreman, Silas Boone, pushed his way down the center aisle. That land was promised for the rail spur. We have contracts. Any contracts made for stolen land are void, Mr. Boone, Reverend Thompson said firmly. And I believe the sheriff would be interested in examining how those contracts came to be. Sheriff Calloway nodded slowly. Indeed, I would. And I reckon the territorial marshal might take an interest, too. He fixed Boone with a hard stare. The law will be watching every move your railroad makes from now on. Best remember that. The foreman's face reddened, but he fell silent, backing, away from the sheriff's steady gaze. In the quiet that followed, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Tucker, the general store owner's wife who had once whispered suspicious words about savages, stood up from her pew. She walked to where Nallen sat and took both her hands. Welcome home, dear, she said clearly, loud enough for all to hear. We're glad to have you as our neighbor. Like a dam breaking, other women rose and came forward. The blacksmith's wife, the school teacher, ranchers' wives who had kept their distance before. They surrounded Nallen with smiles and gentle touches, their previous prejudice dissolved by her courage and dignity. The church erupted in applause, led by these same women. Donald watched Nallen's face transform as she smiled fully for the first time since he'd found her, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them with joy. His heart swelled at the sight. As the afternoon sun began to the windows, the gathering slowly dispersed. The sheriff led Hensley away to the jail, while groups of townspeople lingered to shake Donald's hand and welcome Nallen properly to the community. Finally, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Donald helped Nallen into his wagon for the ride. Home. The trail back to his ranch was peaceful, broken only by the steady crunch of wheels and the occasional call of a winter bird. They arrived as dusk was settling in. The barn still stood in charred ruins, a stark reminder of the violence they'd faced. But somehow its blackened beams seemed less threatening now, more like a marker of trials overcome. It ain't much, Donald said softly as he helped her down. But we'll rebuild come spring. Inside, he lit the lamp and stoked the stove while Nallen moved naturally to the kitchen, finding beans and cornbread, left from morning. They shared this simple meal and comfortable, Silence. Both too tired for many words, but drawing strength from each other's presence as full darkness fell outside. Donald rose and crossed to the corner where his late wife's rocking chair stood. He ran his hand along its smooth wooden arm. Remembering countless evenings when Sarah had sat there, mending or reading by lamplight, then he turned to Nalin. "This home is yours too, if you'll have it," he said quietly, gesturing to the chair. Sarah would have wanted someone to use it proper. Nalin stood slowly, her eyes soft in the lamplight. She walked to where Donald stood and gently placed her hand over his where it rested on the chair's arm. The touch was light, but carried the weight of all they had endured together in that moment. With snow falling softly outside and the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls, they both knew they'd found something more precious than raising rights or legal victories. They'd found home. Dawn painted the snow-covered valley in soft pink light as Donald and Nalin mounted their horses. The disputed pasture stretched before them, pristine white replacing the railroad's survey stakes. Nalin's voice carried softly on the morning air as she whispered an Apache prayer, tears glistening in her eyes. "My father would be proud," she said, touching the deed in her pocket. Donald nodded, gesturing toward his burned barn. "Come spring, we'll rebuild. Might even have us a barn raising." Nalin's eyes brightened. Perhaps one day, a small schoolhouse too, where all children can learn together. They rode back at midday to find wagons lining the ranch yard. Neighbors bustled about, unloading lumber and tools. Women set up tables with steaming coffee and fresh bread. The air filled with the rhythm of hammers and saws as the frame of a new barn began to rise by evening. Lanterns cast a warm glow over tables laden with food. Donald carved roasted beef while Nalin ladled out her rich stew. A fiddle struck up a lively tune, and Donald's deep laugh rang out, free and unguarded. Nalin watched him from across the crowded yard, her heart full. She had found more than justice here. She had found home. The late March sun warmed the churchyard as Donald and Nalin strolled between weathered headstones after Sunday service. Children darted around them, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Little Sarah Miller tugged at Nalin's skirt, eyes bright. "With hope? Teacher Nalin, will you show me more letters today?" the child asked. "Tomorrow, little one." "I promise," Nalin answered, patting Sarah's hand gently. Donald stopped beneath a flowering dogwood tree, his weathered face softening. "Nalin," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "would you build a life here with me?" Her eyes shimmered with joyful tears as she clasped his calloused hands in answer. The following week, the church pews filled with townsfolk. Reverend Thompson smiled broadly as he joined their hands. Donald stood proud in his pressed black coat, while Nalin glowed in a cream-colored dress borrowed from Mrs. Thompson. That evening, beneath a vast starlit sky, they walked hand in hand to their newly rebuilt barn. The scent of fresh pine wrapped around them as Donald whispered, "2 ranches, 1 heart." Together, they stepped across the threshold into their shared future. Summer sun bathed the valley in golden light. Children's laughter floated from the new schoolhouse by Little Dry Creek, its fresh-cut timber still fragrant. Donald had hewn every beam himself, while Nalin's careful planning made it a place of learning. Inside, Apache and white children sat, shoulder to shoulder, slate pencils scratching as they formed letters. Donald leaned against the split-rail fence, his heart full watching Nalin move between the rows. Her gentle voice guided each child with endless patience. The children scattered homeward. Nalin joined Donald beneath a towering cottonwood, her hand finding his. Together they walked toward the thriving barn, pausing at a small mound covered in prairie grass. Nalin knelt, laying fresh wildflowers on Ashke's grave, whispering thanks in Apache for the brave Mustang sacrificed as evening settled. Lantern light spilled from their ranch house windows. They sat close on the porch, Donald's prayer rising, soft in the twilight. "Lord, thank you for second chances," he murmured, "and the courage to stand for what's right." The spirit of that fierce Mustang lived on in their union, in children's voices raised in friendship, and in the healing of land that had known too much strife. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you. Again, subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.